You might get the attention of Disney, but whatever.
I'm pretty sure, aren't Disney and Pixar like different companies?
No, they merged in the mid 2000s.
Yeah, that's what
They
I was
might have
wondering.
they might have split again, but if they have, that's news to me.
All right. Well, anyways, yeah, the stream started.
Oh, well. Hey everybody. Yeah, I don't know how much of that conversation you heard, but basically Heretic and I was talking with Heretic about like whether or not the title of the stream would would fucking piss Disney off because Disney's like one of the worst companies when it comes to DMCA. But anyway, uh yeah, the reason we titled the stream that though, do you want to go ahead and talk about the subject of tonight's stream?
Yeah, so there's this guy whose name, let me just look it up real quick. Tristan won't shut up, who is
Now, yeah, you're not gonna believe this when I tell you this, but you're going to see sort of immediately what we're talking about when we start. He is like I almost can't even believe I'm saying this. He's a worse version of Thought Slime in terms of his content and presentation. As in, he tries to imitate Thought Slime's style of presentation, but like he's worse than Thought Slime in terms of the actual arguments that he makes.
it's a Chinese. It's really strange because Thought Slime tries really hard to be endearing with his self-deprecating humor. Of course, the problem is he's not funny and he's kind of repulsive to look at. But at least he has a clear style that he's going for. Whereas this is someone who's kind of took that idea, but took away all of the personality and all of the attempts to differentiate himself from any other breadtuber, and just kept all of the college level snarkiness, all of the John Leibowitz personality.
Yeah, he's yeah, the thing with Thought Slime is his shtick is fairly simple. Um Not necessarily use self-deprecating humor, but self-deprecate as a way to try to take the wind out of the sails of whoever is criticizing him. So basically he'll say something about his argument, or he'll say something about his style of presentation. The thought process behind it is very clearly that, oh, well, if I say this in the video, then nobody else can say it to me afterwards, because if they do, I'm making fun of their argument in advance. Ironically, how silly. It's really dumb, and it hasn't really worked out for him. People just haven't really responded to it. Like that is one thing I'll say about the BreadTube community, is that you could make the argument that there's definitely a lot to be responded to there, and very few people have responded to it. I think that's kind of a mix of the fact that the sort of the previously existing commentary communities were incredibly dumb, and while the BreadTube channel's philosophies as their philosophies are really dumb. They're rhetorically skilled enough that they can talk circles around the 2016 era skeptics fairly easily. But but yeah, Thought Slime is sort of like the bottom of the barrel, I'd say, of the bigger BreadTube content creators. The other thing that he does is he sort of presents himself and his arguments um, as though like he's suggesting that he's stupid, and it's like, oh, instead of explaining himself, he just comes up he it comes off as though he's trying to suggest, oh, well, even a stupid motherfucker like me can get it, why can't you get it? Like it's bizarre, frankly.
I mean, we know
But
why
I
it's
mean, I will give him props that it's unique.
it's not really unique. It's something that you see quite a bit with the self-deprecating humor. It's as you said that, well, if a stupid dumbass like me can get it, then why can't you? Or this is so simple, even a retard can understand it. And it's not only in an attempt to prop up his own arguments, but it's also, as we talked about earlier, to deflect criticism away from being from people who would otherwise be able to respond to it. It's, as you said earlier, trying to take the sails or trying to take the wind out of the sails of their critics by making the point first. Also, at the same
Usually,
time, it also serves as a pretty useful red herring in the sense that if you're watching this video and he makes a bunch of like really dumb asinine arguments, your actual ability to conceptualize in your mind why they're wrong, the problems with the arguments, like immediately just go out of the way the moment he brings up that he's an idiot. Or that he brings up that he's an idiot himself. Because suddenly that becomes the focus. That becomes the fixation.
yeah, and in terms of the actual substance of the arguments he's putting forward, it's just laughable. Most of the time, they're straw man arguments of concepts which are fairly easy to refute, even from the perspective of the people he's trying to ascribe these arguments to. I mean, that's the first major problem is he's one of those people that within the BreadTube circles doesn't really understand a lot of the arguments that he's responding to and tries to amalgamate a bunch of different positions he doesn't like under the label of like neoliberalism or whatever. So his arguments come off most of the time as like a slightly more mild version of the takes that like Vicky would put out. Vicky 1999, except he's well read enough at the very least to know why things like ANCAP Keynesianism just make him look like a boob. So he doesn't make those kinds of statements, but he will. The thing with him is that it's usually fairly obvious when he's trying to construct a straw man argument because he'll present the concept that he's talking about with like this sarcastic tone before he explains what it means. And he like only does that when he's about to straw man the shit out of a concept. It's very interesting to watch, but I wouldn't say that it's good quality, but it's interesting nonetheless. But yeah, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. So what I don't know. Do you have anything to say?
I don't really have much more to add to that. I mean, this is an 18-minute video, and I can't imagine we're going to get through all of it simply because we're going to come to a point where he's just going to start repeating himself. I mean, that's what a lot of these BreadTubers do. They just have they either get to a point where they just start repeating themselves, or they just start making non-arguments in an attempt to pad out the video time so that it looks better on the YouTube algorithm. But anyways, I'm perfectly willing to get started.
Yeah, sure.
All right, let's go.
Hey everybody, did you know that markets and capitalism increase innovation and keep people motivated so that we're always having new products and people feel motivated to keep going back to work? Because
now back to the title of the stream. I think you can see why the stream is titled the way that it is. The individual in the video here, this guy Tristan won't shut up. He bears a striking resemblance to the owner of Al's Toy Barn from the movie Toy Story 2.
Let me just pull it up on oh, it's way too big. I'm just gonna pull it up on the stream so people can see. Yep, there we
Yeah,
go.
I made that comparison in Discord the other day when somebody linked this video in there. But
I hope
I don't know why that. I don't know why, but that's the first thing that I thought when I saw this guy.
yeah, people on stream now can see a side by side comparison I have on screen. Yeah, it is nearly identical. The only real difference I can see is one, the color of their shirt. Two, Tristan has a chin strap, or at least has sideburns, and Al has a comb over. Whereas Tristan has a receding. No, they both have receding hairlines. Never mind. But
Give
he
them about 5 to 10 years, and they'll probably have the same hairstyle.
probably. I mean, he's got the what's his name? The bathrobe Dwayne Pac-Man hair line.
Pac-Man hairline. I'm sorry. That's fucking great.
But yeah, like all Al needs is the sideburns, and they would be nearly identical. It's uncanny. So, anyways, is there anything else we need to say about this? Because I don't want. I'm covering up the chat with Al, and I really don't want to be.
Yeah, I didn't really have any more to add to that, other than the obvious fact that this is going to be another one. This is going to be another one of those annoying Marxist type videos where the term capitalism is employed to refer to a myriad of different things. I mean, that's sort of what the term exists to do,
Mm-hmm.
but
And
a
this,
myriad of different concepts are being referred to, which are very patently incompatible with one another, and they're being conflated under this one umbrella concept that is capitalism.
and also, there's this one other thing I noticed when the video began. Like, what's this whole thing about the constant pauses with Marx? It's always Marxoids that do this, where they take a dramatic pause every other word.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure about that, but Thought Slime does that, and I'm pretty sure this guy gets it from Thought Slime.
Probably. I'm perfectly willing to call Tristan just discount Thought Slime. I'm sorry, Chinese bootleg Thought Slime.
I mean, seriously, it's as if when he sits down to make a video, he sits there and thinks to himself, how would Thought Slime present this subject?
Probably. I mean, Thought Slime, because he's heavily selected for in the YouTube algorithm, does have a pretty large channel, and so he thinks that just by copying his homework, he can try to capitalize on that success insofar as you can even be successful in YouTube anymore. So, anyway, should we continue?
Yeah, sure.
I just started back from the beginning because I thought it would be useful to appreciate the breathy pauses that I was alluding to earlier, and just to see them again in their full glory.
Hey everybody, did you know that markets and capitalism increase innovation and keep people motivated so that we're always having new products and people feel motivated to keep going back to work? Because in my video where I talked about why Walmart shows that planned economies are way more efficient than, market economies, a lot of you said that to me. Competition drives innovation.
Okay, so it's very interesting that he is making the distinction between markets and capitalism. That's a bit more sophisticated than your standard Marxist take in YouTube, at the very least. For those who aren't familiar, in orthodox Marxist theory, markets and capitalism are treated as two different subjects. And Marxists argued that capitalism was basically what the free market anarchists then and the left market anarchists now referred to as, well, they refer to it now as the cash nexus or the political economy, or, well, it is just the political economy. That's not a left market anarchist concept. The idea that there are institutions that set rates and that are defended by state power, that's completely uncontroversial. But yeah, most Marxists don't make the distinction, and Marx made the distinction in chapter 25 of volume 1, when he was describing primitive accumulation. He made the distinction between markets and capitalism, that markets existed that markets exist independently of what he's calling capitalism, but that through things such as the Enclosure Acts, this sort of capitalist, quote unquote, infrastructure was able to be built, which is basically a political economy that, prescribed market rates. So properly understood, that is what Marxists are talking about. But of course, even Marx went on to try to. Marx was, at the very least, agnostic on this, and it's very heavily insinuated throughout Capital that this was a natural process of the market. And then there's, of course, the circular reasoning behind Marx's dialectic, where the capitalist system created the state, but also the state existed to defend it. So there's a very clear inconsistency there.
I mean, that's what we would call a chicken or the egg.
Yeah. As for what Tristan was arguing, I don't really understand this sort of efficiency argument. I mean, I do understand it, but it's very interesting that Marxists never actually address the real point of contention being put forward by their critics, which is really not a skepticism towards any sort of model of firm, or on efficiency grounds. That seems to be a rhetorical trick that Marxists employ to try to force the conversation back into a framework of discussion that they can control. It's usually, if not entirely, just that there are ethical problems with state planning, and or that the ends being advocated are inconsistent with the means being suggested by Marxists, which is something that I was talking about the other day, that about state socialism, which is that state socialists are actually advocating for a radical form of proprietorship, even compared to the model which the modern political economy is structured around, because state socialists are suggesting that every firm within the political economy needs to have their resource allocation, just assuming that it was even theoretically possible to do this and to sustain a model based around this. But for every firm to have their entire production process planned out by a single monopoly entity, either the state or whatever they're going to call their union cartel, which takes the function of the state.
It's going to be a very interesting premise, and honestly, that might be worth a response in its own right. Maybe, probably not.
So-
Just going into that absolutely insane, ludicrous idea that somehow Walmart proves that planned economies are significantly more efficient. I mean, you sent me the tweet thread by Per Byland from sometime, I think it was July 2019, don't remember the exact date, where he was replying to this exact same topic. What he pointed out was that the Walmart is hardly the best example, especially because you can't really compare the structure of a single firm to that of an entire national economy. Forget about the whole economy being there not being one single economy in any given geographic location, because every nation, every state, every city, every street, every household is going to have its own economy. Even if you just look at it from a purely national scale, from in the economy as enclosed by a government's arbitrary borders, you're still going to have a very significant problem by attempting to look at it from the perspective as though it were a single firm, because a national economy is not a single firm. It is innumerable firms. It is, if you were to look at it from a problem as a management problem, then naturally you're going to be trying to solve problems that simply do not exist, because you're not just it's not just one firm that's trying to manage its own resources. It's billions and billions of firms, each of which are engaging in innumerable interactions every single day. Any kind of signals that would be necessary for anything that resembled efficient planning to exist can only occur if planning does not occur at all. And this is something that I believe it was Hayek that pointed out with the economic calculation problem, and his building up on that concept, that the signals necessary for economic planning to even be efficient at all, as opposed to just be purely guesswork, can only occur if central planning cannot possibly occur, paradoxically. And so, with this in mind, sorry, continue.
Oh, were you done?
Yeah, I was done.
Okay. And this is something that state socialists of all varieties simply don't understand, either by willful ignorance or because the actual point of contention flew way over their head. Which I'm having an increasingly difficult time believing that in most cases it's the latter, because of how just how clear the Austrians and even a lot of other schools of economic thought have been, that you can't just dismiss this criticism by pointing to what?
Sorry, it's just that your audio peaked.
Oh, okay. Sorry. But you can't just dismiss this problem by pointing to planning of firms on a local scale for reasons Heretic pointed out within a market. But you also can't dismiss this problem by trying to change the parameters of what counts as planning arbitrarily, or by trying to point to the fact that planning exists. The reason that you can't do this, though, is because first of all, the criticism is not that it is not on the grounds of efficiency, or to argue that planning can't exist. It's an information problem, which is something that people starting from the perspective that economies are a model that you can prescribe are not really going to understand. But basically, economic transactions and the outcome of economic actions, they're a revealed preference exclusively. They're not something you could ever know in advance. It would be literally impossible to do so because so much of what goes into an economic action is determined by things that can't be planned in advance, such as how an individual interprets their environment, what their environment is going to be, uh, where and why they're going to associate with the people in advance to their transaction. That influences their environment. Conditions in their person or their attitudes before they engage in transactions. Like, I don't know, are they hungry? That's not really something that you can plan. That's not really something that you can plan in advance, especially with how fickle the human body is. And you also can't plan on the production side what the firm or what the person selling is going to, what their circumstances are going to be like. Even because on a small, broadly you might be able to do this, but on an individual scale, there are, I used to work in a white market retail job, so I saw this happen on a regular basis. People knock things off of shelves inside of the stores and don't report it because there's, when you are dealing with a firm that operates on that scale and is protected by that degree of legal privilege, there's a direct disincentive to report things like that. So that goes unaccounted for, and it necessarily will go unaccounted for.
I hope everyone
we got
is
a
enjoying
super
the
chat.
stream, and remember, kill niggers,
Oh, nice.
twist heads off niggers. Defecate on niggers, food roundhouse, kick a nigger, slam dunk nigger babies into garbage. Disposals. Mr. Dapperton styles his hairline after the McDonald's arches.
What did it say?
Kill tryhards, twist tryhards, heads off, defecate on tryhards food, roundhouse kick a tryhard. and they said, our donator said Mr. Dapperton styles his hairline after the McDonald's arches.
Yeah, they do. It does bear a striking resemblance for sure.
Now, this is not us saying that.
Yeah.
This is what our donators say. So don't get upset, Mr. Dapperton.
Anyway, yeah, appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you for the $2.
Yeah, the problem that they don't really seem to understand is that when they're putting forward an argument against the Austrians, and specifically the economic calculation problem, because I would personally argue that the Austrian methodology is the only one that doesn't have problem and forms of information problems, because as much as monetarists, for example, would like to argue that they are skeptical of planning, they're really not. In fact, their entire methodology, its conclusion is that this is an ideal model for financial planning. By which I mean planning the financial aspect of the legal market. So basically, they're efficiency experts for the government. But anyway, so what we're actually arguing, and this is something that state socialists are willfully oblivious to. Well, they're oblivious to whether or not it's willful, but I'm convinced that most of the time it is just being disingenuous. it is a point. It is a question of what counts as an economic principle, and that's basically fun. On a fundamental level, what we're arguing is that you can't prescribe economies like this. As Heretic noted earlier, every economy is different, and economies, every household is a different economy, every street is a different economy, and that is going to change incentives people have to exchange resources, or what information they're going to use and how they're going to use that information. And these are all things that you need to take into consideration, and you can't do this from the perspective of a planner. In fact, that's sort of the point of a planned approach to economic modeling. To create an economic model itself is to negate this. So state socialists can't really, in order to acknowledge this, they would have to undermine state socialism, or they would have to underline the fundamental approach state socialists take to trying to argue for economic models.
I know one way that planners have attempted to get around this is to try to argue that the problem of economic calculation is simply a result of a lack of processing power, and that if you build a sufficiently powerful computer, it would be able to receive enough inputs and be able to make enough calculations fast enough that it would be able to provide an efficient plan when it was needed, or at least fast enough to when it was needed, such that the information being sent would not be out of date. The trouble is that I can guarantee you with 100% certainty, any intelligence or any artificial intelligence smart enough to even come close to doing this, even hypothetically if it were possible, would recognize that there is a paradox in the information that is necessary for efficient economic planning to take place, never possibly existing in an economy that is centrally planned in the first place. And as such, for central planning to even be possible, you need to not have central planning.
That's just that's, I think, the best argument that they have, but it's still a categorical error because it assumes that the ECP is like making an efficiency argument, when no, literally, even if you had an impossibly powerful computer, you would still have issues, because there are things in the economic process which are like, it's not conceptually sound to even try to model them, to try to plan them. Like, how do you model how I'm going to interpret information? Like purely using data points. And more importantly, how do you do this for like literally every single person? That's what you would have to do in order to even try to plan an economy in the sense that state socialists are arguing. So when you look or any sort of economic planning, for that matter, would require the ability to do this. And from the outset, it's patently absurd, and it's obvious why you can't approach economic study this way.
Do we believe in any capacity that any state socialists or any of these proponents for central planning have any belief whatsoever in free will? That they aren't just like raging determinists who think that humans are just just some mirror reflection cast by their environments?
No, Marxist theory is pretty explicit about determinism from his perspective, and when you contextualize you contextualize the material dialectic in that sense, I mean, it's really the only way that even internally it's coherent. But yeah, state socialism kind of relies on the viability of determinism, and that's a problem because determinism is an incoherent concept.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tautology.
Mm-hmm. But I think that's we're getting to the underlying understanding, or rather, something that vaguely resembles an understanding that the Marxoids go on in order to come to the conclusion that human behavior and human action can be mathematically modeled. Because if you can reduce all environmental factors to a series of data points, then you could predict human behavior with one-to-one accuracy. Eventually, you could.
The other problem with determinism is that when faced with any attempt to refute determinism, determinists can just shift the goalpost. So determinism they can change what their initial claim was. Say for instance, you were arguing over principles in the philosophy of action. Someone argues, I don't know, mental conditions prove determinism. Well, you can point to something like neuroplasticity, which shows that the mental state of a human is a lot more fluid than that seems to suggest, and we can sort of demonstrate that. Even absent the observation of neuroplasticity, again, that would be an argument where there would be nothing that could ever be used to count against its premise, and this is sort of where it goes wrong, because if you point to neuroplasticity, they can just say, neuroplasticity is something that all people have, and that proves human action is deterministic. So literally, the ability to interpret your environment differently, or to put yourself into a new environment of your choosing, and that altering your brain chemistry by changing how neural networks form. By any rational standard, what would be considered proof of free will, proof of agency, can be twisted as actually being proof of determinism. So yeah, it's obviously nonsense.
Yeah, don't really think there's much more to add to that. So let's go ahead and continue. Honestly, you probably refuted half the video just there.
Motivation, and that's why millions of people have to starve. It's just basic economics. It seems like every economics 101 textbook is like, chapter 1, if I have a lemon and you have $1, you can pay that $1 for that lemon, and it is a mutually beneficial exchange. And then chapter 10 is like, and this is why we had to kill several thousand people in South America to keep the price of bananas low. It's like, okay. So again, the idea that competition breeds innovation and motivation.
He makes the dichotomy between markets and what he's calling capitalism, yet he treats markets and economic theory as though if you're arguing for markets, you necessarily are arguing from the perspective of economic principles, but also principles in economic study. But also he's conflating that with the Marxian quote unquote capitalist ideology, or apologetics for capitalism. So I mean, just from right off the bat, he's being disingenuous. He's being disingenuous very openly. I don't even at this point. I'm not even entirely sure that that was intentional. Making the dichotomy between markets and capitalism, their shtick, is kind of dependent on conflating the two, even though that's kind of dubious, even in Marxist theory.
Well, I mean, how often have we heard the canard that capitalism has killed millions of people?
Yeah.
It's a very
Also,
it's a very common thing
that's
where they genuinely believe that the action of mutually beneficial exchange is identical to governments sending troops into foreign countries in order to protect the interests of their business partners and cartels.
like state socialist governments haven't done that because, newsflash, the Soviet Union was basically an empire in that regard. I mean, how many countries did the Soviet Union annex?
Half of Europe, literally, and a very large chunk of Asia. I mean, not only it's like half of Europe all the way up to Germany, part of the Soviet Union, but she also had the entirety of what is now known as the stands. Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, all of those countries are former Soviet satellite states.
Right.
Now,
And the reason that the Soviet Union did that was a direct consequence of incentives created by their political economic model. And that's not unique to the Soviet Union by any means. Um, when you're in the later stages of statism and you have a state that's more influential in the sort of unipolar uh, political dichotomy between the states, the pyramid between the states, like the U.S. government and China, for instance, you'll see similar behaviors. That's for them. That's the reason that those states do that is because they're the aspect of their political infrastructure where all the planning being done, like the financial market, for instance, and how supply enters the market, the supply cartels like the World Trade Organization or the World Bank, the Trilateral Commission. Those start falling apart, so they have to start engaging in increasing militarism to protect their interests. With the Soviet Union, since they're basically they're constantly falling apart because they tried to plan many aspects of their political economy as possible. They're always incentivized to do that, and they have the extra added incentive of doing this specifically to appropriate resources from other nations. That is, I mean, that is just immediate. It's immediately apparent why that's not sustainable, or why that's even more fickle than the political economies of modern states. And I just want to bring this up because I don't think we've mentioned this. But at the same time, I'm not even entirely sure that it really needs to be mentioned. But political economies are not the same thing as markets, and markets cannot create political economies. The state needs to exist to do that, because the state is the only entity which can create a systemically coercive barriers to entry and can monopolize arbitration in a way. So certain actors can be afforded privileges that the state will defend, which gives them an incentive to scale upwards more so than other actors in the market would be able to, and be protected from liability for things that if other actors in the market were to do would ruin them.
Mm-hmm. It goes without saying that the observation that Western governments, what Marx always would characterize as capitalist governments, even though they could never possibly define them, going into foreign countries and using their military power to defend the financial interests of their business partners. Yeah, that was absolutely terrible, and they are correct in identifying that as terrible. However, because they operate under a very broken framework of understanding how political economies form, how they function, and why they exist the way that they do, they fundamentally lack the ability to really conceptually refute the idea of a political economy, and they certainly don't have the ability to create any kind of lasting or even anything that vaguely resembles a solution for it. The best that they can do is state a vaguely moral conclusion and hope that their explanation is glib enough to be able to dazzle anyone who happens to be listening to the conversation at that particular point in time. Not really very useful for, actually solving problems, when what we actually have in terms of political economies is a problem of coercion, a problem of an inequality of authority. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, just what I was going to hold on a minute. But just what I was going to say is it's really laughable that the state socialists, I mean, the progressive movement's the worst example of this, because they're like literally just verbatim repeating the things that were the policy positions and the principles being argued by the eugenics movement under the guise of social justice causes. State socialists are bad in this regard as well, because they're taking the worst things that would have been defended by the old right by the 19th in the 19th century, state intervention, political economies, so state taking people's land and resources away in order to try to force them into cities, or to put several degrees of leverage over them, which incentivize them to engage in certain models of organization which benefit the state's interests. This is actually not something that should be initially was or should be ascribed to the free market position, because if you want to even call it that, the market position, market anarchy, is a leveling force, because it gets rid of these barriers to entry and gets rid of these privileges that allow these market actors to continue operating the way that they do. It's actually properly understood. It's actually the state socialists and the advocates of planning whom these criticisms should be directed at, because that's exactly what they're arguing. In fact, if you look back at the 19th century, things like antitrust laws, the initial Sherman Antitrust Act, were explicitly promoted as a way to try to crush competition in the legal economy. If you look at the effect of every antitrust act, it's pretty clear that that's what it does. For instance, if you look at the 1910 antitrust laws, Standard Oil had like 29 different competitors in the legal market before then. And around that time, more than 90% of the U.S. population was, self-employed. I'm not going to argue that an antitrust act led to people becoming dispossessed specifically. That process began a long time before. But yeah, by the 1920s, Standard Oil only had 3 competitors, and those competitors were all companies that were initially part of Standard Oil. So, yeah, if you look at, and if you go further back, in any sort of state intervention, the way that they were framed in mainstream discourse was that, oh well, this makes market actors more accountable because, well, this makes market actors more accountable because you can't trust competition to level these political entities. You need to have these monopolies in the market because they're defended by the state, and because they're defended by the state, that's how you can tell they're accountable. That's initially how state intervention was marketed, but the anarchists pretty effectively made the case against that. So they had to, the state had to pull a big sneaky and try to, put subversives within the libertarian movement that, pulled a hoppa and tried to advocate for their ends using framing statist means as being a way to achieve their ends.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's for those of you who don't know, Marx was an infiltrator. If you look at how he was introduced to because that's the first place that he went. He tried to associate with the libertarian and anarchist circles, and he was not very well liked by any of them because at the time they all sort of knew exactly what he was doing. And Capital was financed to the tune of like $3 million at the time by Nathan Rothschild to be published. So there were some very powerful financial interests directly backing Marx's work.
Mm-hmm. In addition to that, I am reminded of the progressive era, where not only did you have business interests who were begging the government to create barriers to entry for their competition, although it was marketed towards making sure that they were held accountable and that their competitors were quote unquote held accountable. But what was actually going on was, of course, you were raising barriers to entry, thus allowing, but mandating that businesses cartelize just to be able to be profitable. I think I remember one particular example that Murray Rothbard pointed out in the Progressive Era, his book, where there was a attempt to cartelize freight rates among the railroad companies. Now, of course, you can imagine in the late 19th, early 20th century, the railroad industry was an incredibly capital-intensive industry, because you had to not only have your own proprietary rail lines, which are incredibly capital-intensive to set up, but you also need your own trains, your own connections, that sort of thing. So you can imagine the number of competitors just by merely existing was incredibly limited. And yet, all attempts by railroad companies to cartelize freight rates were always and consistently doomed to fail, because every time some cartel freight rate agreement was set up, all that would do was incentivize either some smaller competitor to undercut the cartel, or it would encourage one of the cartelizers to break from the cartel with promises of gigantic financial rewards from the huge amount of market share they hope to gain. And so the only way that they were able to set freight rates at all was because they went to the government to mandate certain price floors for freight rates, and that was the only way that they were able to get freight rates to get where they were going to go. Now, you also have something similar going on with Karl Marx's infiltration of the anarchist movement and the socialist movement, going on with a lot of, I'm not sure what the term. I want to say that the progressives were a controlled opposition movement who were basically just paid for by financial interests to protest to the government. Please hold these industry cartels accountable. They're so evil and terrible and wrong. But we can't trust them to do it themselves. We need the government to monopolize and control everything.
Well, the progressive movement at the time would have just been the eugenics movement. Karl Marx would have probably fit more in the category of people like Ferdinand Lassalle or the other state socialists around the end of the 19th century who were doing exactly what I was suggesting earlier. They were suggesting that you could achieve ends like inequality of authority by pursuing statist means. If the state were only to plan the entire economy, seize direct control of everyone's resources, and then decide who can or can't use them in certain ways. Well, that would be inequality of authority, and that would get rid of economic privilege. But and because in the concept of entailment and epistemology were the main focuses of debate for libertarianism at the time, that wasn't taken too kindly to. In fact, for people who are somewhat familiar with the history of the first international IWW, Bakunin was actually kicked out of IWW because he exposed the fact that Karl Marx was being paid by the Rothschilds, and in the middle of one of their meetings, ditched him out over it.
Yeah,
to say, I mean
sorry.
I was just going to say the reason that it took, Marxists are they're accurate in the sense that Marx wasn't very popular when he was alive. It's not really though that he was part of a small